Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. Secure Talk is brought to you by AdeQuest, your cybersecurity and compliance partner. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking with Neil Madden, who is the security director at ForgeRock and is also the author of API Security in Action. And we're going to be talking about how that you can securely deploy APIs, different types of APIs that are available for web applications, and how to choose what is the most appropriate API given your security constraints or objectives. So hey Neil, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Good.
How are you?
Good. This is, like I said, a bit of an experiment. This is only the second time we've done the video recording, so who knows what could happen here. But where are you calling in from?
I'm based in a place called Stroud in the UK. It's part of the Cotswolds, so yeah, it's got a nice place, rolling hills and nice old buildings.
Give me an image. Okay, so like you've got London, and then you've got Leeds up here, and then where
So we're kind of on the kind of edge where Wales meets England at the south of Wales, basically, kind of thing. So yeah, just on the border with Wales.
So you probably get plenty of lovely, rainy, cloudy days and all that.
Yeah, lots of rain here.
Yeah. I'm from Seattle, so I felt quite at home when I was in the UK. Well, hey, Neil, you've got a very, very interesting background. You actually have a PhD in computer science.
Yeah, that's right. So I kind of went to uni and got sucked into kind of staying on and doing a PhD. So I ended up spending about 9 years at university. Studying, and eventually got a PhD kind of in like a branch of artificial intelligence. So this was all it was like agent-based computing.
Okay.
So it was kind of very different from what I ended up doing in the end, moving into the kind of cybersecurity side of things. But
there is
an interesting time.
There is obviously an increasingly large amount. That's not the right word. An increasing amount of AI being used in security, and so does any of that tie into what you were studying?
Not
necessarily.
Really.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting. It's like because now we've had this kind of wave of machine learning that's come in and has just kind of revolutionized everything in AI. That came in it was just starting to come in just as I was finishing my PhD. And it's kind of like, I look back now and like that would have revolutionized everything I worked on in my PhD as well. But it was kind of like, I kind of missed that wave. So I kind of...
They say 90% is timing, right? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I missed that one.
In addition to your PhD and to the work you do, you've also written a book called API Security in Action. Why would you write a book?
Why would I write a book? That's a question I've asked myself a lot of times since agreeing to write it. I always kind of thought in the back of my head, it would be nice to write a book, and I'd had some ideas kicking around for a book I might write, but I'd kind of put them on the back burner until, and it was actually the publisher who approached me, so Manning Publications approached me and said, we've read some of your blog posts and seen some talks that I'd done that were on YouTube, and we think you can write reasonably well. Would you be interested in thinking about writing a book? And so we kind of then ended up having a conversation about it. I wasn't sure what exactly I was going to write about then, and through some kind of back and forth and conversations, we kind of hit on API security as being the kind of topic that would best suit me for kind of writing a book. So 2 years later, it finally got out the door, and
that's a serious commitment, very serious commitment. Yeah. So, I'm going to be very honest with you. I haven't had the time to read your book. I've gone through it, and what I realized after kind of browsing through is that we could probably have because typically these sessions last for 30, 40 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but we could probably spend hours and hours and hours because you've got so many different areas of both different types of APIs, and how to use them in the most secure manner, etc. So, but today maybe we can kind of scratch the surface. Why don't you tell us a little bit about? I think in your book you have an analogy, in terms of what API security is. Something about taking your driving test. Could you tell us? Maybe we can start off with that to kind of set the stage, and then kind of dip our toes a little deeper in the water.
Yeah. So the taking the driving test was just a kind of it was a nice kind of story and a kind of easy way to kind of introduce some of the topics of API security. So, when you make a request to an API, there's a bunch of processes that have to be gone through. Like there's a kind of authentication step of working out who is making this request, and then there's some kind of authorization. Can they do what they're supposed to do? And there's different types of authorization. And so for the authentication, you might go from just kind of knowing who somebody is from kind of past experiences through to kind of like positively looking for some kind of formal ID. And this was the idea of the driving test. You don't just turn up to a driving test and they go, hi, Neil.
Right.
You have to show some kind of like documentation, right? And usually in some form of like photo ID or whatever. And then you've got, different types of authorization, and then things like audit logging and things like that, which I got into, of kind of all these different processes that have to be followed to make an API secure, and just kind of trying to make that into a nice analogy.
I like it.
It's probably the most controversial thing in the book, I'd say. from the reviews when we were writing the book, that story at the front is the real, what we'd call a Marmite moment here, that you either love it or hate it.
Well,
it's like some people are like, oh, I really got that story.
Well, it's funny because my second son just passed his driver's test, and it wasn't the first time he took it, and he was kind of nervous because he's coming back from school break, and we you got to sign up, and because of the COVID stuff, it's really it's a more complicated process these days, right? And he showed up, and he was totally prepped, and he was convinced that he was going to do it. And he forgot his ID. So it's funny that you mentioned that, because luckily for him, I was across the street, and with I had my pack with me, and I don't know how it happened, but I had his ID and the car registration, which you need both of them. Actually, you need to show the proof of ownership, proof of insurance, and your. So for me, the analogy works. Okay, so I get it. So. You kind of go on from there, and you talk about some of the different API styles and typical deployments. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
so there are when people talk about an API, there's lots of different kind of meanings for what that word can mean. And this book is primarily about like remotely accessed APIs. So you can also have APIs that are just, between applications on your computer, or between, an application in the operating system. But in this book, we're talking about APIs that are exposed to the internet, which is what API has kind of come to mean in a lot of kind of literature now. So it's things like REST APIs would be one style, where you're using HTTP, and you're using it in a kind of very the way HTTP is, meant to be used, as they say. So you're using, GET requests to read and POST requests to update and things like that. But there's lots of other styles of API that are more popular in different use cases. So we used to do a lot of like SOAP and stuff, using XML, and that was kind of based on like remote procedure calls or remote method calls, where you're kind of you're making what would be a procedure call locally in your language look the same, but it's going out over the network. And then there's that's also now popular in kind of microservices. So Google have kind of revived this with they have this gRPC, which is kind of I guess it stands for Google RPC. I'm trying to remember now, which is kind of very efficient kind of binary API for kind of talking between back-end microservices, where they're mostly in the same data center, and you want it to be really efficient. Whereas REST is kind of highly decoupled, so that the client and server can kind of evolve independently without too much impact on each other. So there's these kind of different API styles, and they have a bit of an impact on how you kind of do the apply API security controls to these.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, there are different API styles out there, and there are different use cases and needs for them. How do you, in your position, keep abreast of terms of the latest API developments? Obviously, your book is very much focused on security, but let's just say in general, in terms of understanding the different evolutions or iterations of API technology and what's going on, how do you keep abreast of that?
Well, through a variety of things, really. I guess I try and, I think primarily the best thing for me is talking to colleagues at work. So I have, regular interactions with lots of developers at my job, and they are themselves going out and keeping abreast of things. So quite often I pick up new ideas from them. But also, I have a bunch of kind of blogs that I follow, and a couple of podcasts I listen to, or used to listen to, I think would be more accurate now. I kind of, between homeschooling and all the rest of it, it's kind of.
Oh, you have kids at home? Kids at home as well?
Yeah, I've got a daughter who's 5, and yeah.
Well, so there's very little schooling, mostly just home. It's like,
yeah,
at that age, yeah, that's challenging.
Yeah,
I mean the ability to focus. I guess that's the challenge. I have 3 children myself, and when they're all home, and we actually homeschooled for a couple of years, many years back, and my wife did most of the work. So, but it's a challenge, man. It really is. Let's get back onto the API topic. You also mentioned the different elements of API security. What are the key elements?
So there's a bunch of different things involved. So there's kind of, every API, you're putting your API out there for a reason. There's some kind of valuable data that you're trying to expose, usually in some way, and so you've got to think about the assets that you're kind of trying to protect with your API security. So what is the valuable thing that you want to protect, and what don't you want to expose, and then you've got to think about the what we call the threat model of kind of who you're worried about, what could go wrong if somebody accessed the wrong data and things like that. So there's kind of looking at that, and then looking at there's a whole bunch of then security mechanisms, which is what the bulk of the book is about how to actually ensure that your security goals, which we talk about in terms of like the CIA triad and things like that, so confidentiality, integrity, availability, and things like that, how they can be achieved in the face of these threats that you're worried about, and so looking at different aspects of security and how they can help you achieve those goals. So I kind of say API security is kind of an intersection of kind of like information security, so controlling access to data and ensuring it's encrypted at rest and in transit and things like that, and then like network security and making sure you've got appropriate kind of rate limiting and kind of network level controls to prevent your API being flooded and overwhelmed, and then kind of application security where you're trying to make sure your API servers can't be brought down by some kind of logic error or bad implementation of cryptography or things like that.
Great. Could you maybe give a couple concrete examples? I think you sort of did in terms of like the data that you're sending and receiving, but some in terms of the assets and then also the different threat models. I mean, what are you seeing out there? In terms of the more prominent types of threats in the context of API security.
Right. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different things, I guess. So it really depends on the API, and we do. I work with ForgeRock, and we've got a lot of customers who are kind of banking customers, and they're there's regulations now that they have to expose APIs to allow third-party developers to, provide access to your bank transactions and things, and even initiate payments and stuff like that. So for them, they have a very severe kind of threat model where they're worried about people stealing money and that kind of thing, and fraud and things like that. So they have a very kind of lockdown threat model where they're worried about people with kind of maybe privileged access to networks and things like that, and they want to kind of protect with a quite much stronger kind of protections than we typically see in the past for a lot of APIs. And then you've got other things like so one of there's an interesting thing we get a lot at work is a lot of customers who are worried about account enumeration. So being able to kind of just work out which users have accounts on the system, which is kind of an interesting thing, because for some people that is a really serious security issue, whereas for other people that is a feature. If you imagine if you're Facebook, being able to find out if your friends have accounts on Facebook is like one of their number one features, right? Because you're again gonna join Facebook. Whereas if you're a health insurance provider or something like that, then that's like a major privacy violation.
I just never thought about that, but it's totally, it's very obvious. I mean, there are certain domains where you don't want people to know that you're there, and there are certain domains where like, hey, I mean, with Facebook, the example is they're serving up you potential friends, and they would say, well, you guys are friends with this person, so you're probably friends with this person, and you could just never do that in in the case of the healthcare provider or financial services or many other types of services out there. So that's interesting. I'm be honest with you, I don't know that much about APIs. You probably already tell that, but I'm familiar with REST, SOAP. You mentioned Natter. Can you just give a brief kind of like overview of those different types of APIs and explain what's good, what's bad, what's ugly?
Yeah. So I guess in the book I kind of lean most towards kind of REST APIs. So REST stands for representational state transfer, right? And it was the kind of the architecture of how the web works, or how the web is supposed to work. So it's kind of seen as a good architecture for APIs that are going to be exposed to the general internet, over the web. And so it kind of has a lot of nice properties, but also a lot of confusing properties that a lot of people get wrong. So it's this idea that each request should be stateless. So you don't have any kind of state on the server for kind of like the conversation that's going on between the client and the server. So every time the client makes a request, it's like a brand new conversation starting every time.
Sure.
So things like that can be interesting. And then one of the things I talk about later in the chapter is about so REST kind of wants things to be driven by hyperlinks. So rather than a client of the API just knowing that it goes to this particular URL to get the user's last login time or something like that, or to get their list of email messages or whatever it is that the API is serving up, then instead of that, the server would return links and say, here's the user that's just logged in, here's a link, here's a URL that you can go to get their current email messages, and then you go and list that, and then each one of those has links and says, if you want to read the message, you go here, and so on. And this is a principle of REST API design, that everything should be hyperlink driven, which kind of distinguishes it from other API styles. And that works quite nicely with some of the security topics that are kind of introduced later in the book. Because I talk about in chapter 9, I talk about capability security, which is where your access to something is not based on who you are. So you don't log in and get a session and then there's something doing checks saying, should you have access to this? It's based on like having lots of individual keys for things. So the analogy people use is it's a bit like your house, right? I mean, for me, certainly my house is the most expensive thing I've ever bought, and yet my house doesn't know who I am when I come in the front door. It doesn't, I have a key which gets me in through that lock, and I have a different key for my front door compared to my back door, compared to my shed. So it means, if I go away and I want to let my neighbor go into my shed, I can give him just the key to the shed. It's not I don't have to give him my ID card and then he can get anywhere in the house. So that's kind of capability security. And it works really nicely with this kind of hypertext driven API style, because you can return these links which have kind of encoded into them individual keys to get into individual parts of the API. And then that means you can share just individual links to get into bits. So that's kind of interesting. So I kind of like the REST style for that.
Are there any times when you want to go with another type of API?
Yeah, I mean, certainly REST works really nicely when you've got like a publicly facing API with lots of different clients that you don't control, because it kind of because it's driven by these hyperlinks, they don't have to know a lot about each other, so it kind of allows you to evolve them independently. But it can add a lot of overhead, and it can be quite inefficient at times. So I think certainly a lot for like back-end microservices, then things like gRPC are more popular because they can be much lower overhead, much faster and more efficient. REST API styles tend to use a lot of formats like JSON that are kind of based on text and are quite sort of flabby on the wire, as it they're quite a lot of overhead. Whereas you can use these more efficient binary protocols. And then in the last part of the book as well, I talk about the Internet of Things, IoT, APIs for devices and things. And there things are often very different, because you have constrained devices that have limited kind of memory and processing power and bandwidth and battery power and things like that. And so you have to use really compact messages with kind of the least overhead possible. So it's different depending on the environment. I think REST is for me still the most general API style, but certainly there's places where I choose something else.
Okay. You like I said, your book, you cover a lot of ground. And one of the things I picked up was there was a section on authentication to prevent spoofing. And in our business, I mean, business email compromise is a huge vector for attack. And you're probably talking about spoofing of an API signal, or are you just talking about similar type spoofing?
Yeah, so it's kind of spoofing in terms of somebody impersonating somebody else to get access to their stuff, usually. So there's various ways. If somebody guesses your password or whatever, then they can log in as you and pretend to be you. So so the purpose of the authentication then is to make sure it really is you when you're performing these requests. And we talk about this in the introduction. I kind of motivate that in the terms of the STRIDE kind of threat modeling technique. So STRIDE is this well-known framework for kind of identifying threats to your API. So you've got this, it's a kind of acronym for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, which is kind of denying you did something, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So these are kind of things that could go wrong with your API, and then we talk about how each of the individual kind of security controls you add eliminates those kind of threats. So in this case, authentication reduces the threat of spoofing. So that's the kind of
okay,
where it's motivated.
Let me ask you just a couple more questions here. Somebody's involved with the project, some type of web service, web application, and they they've never written a book on API security. They're I would just say kind of entry level, but all of a sudden it's been put on their plate. Hey, you know what? We want you to kind of map this out. What advice would you give besides reading your book? What else would you tell
them? So I think that Stride is kind of the important thing there, that kind of threat modeling. So the first thing is to kind of just get really clear in your head what it is that needs protecting and what exactly you're worried about. I think once you get those things clear, then a lot of the rest of it kind of is a case of reading the right book and knowing what to look for. But kind of really just, so many people, that is the point where the kind of clarity comes and they start being more focused on what it is they're solving is kind of just knowing what are the risks, what are you worried about, and then from there then it becomes easy to then see, okay, right, I'm worried about people pretending to be other people, and spoofing, so therefore I'm going to need some kind of authentication, and then I can go and look up and work out what authentication I need and so on. I think that's the place to start. Okay.
So I guess it goes back to even earlier on in our conversation, understanding what your assets are, your security goals, the threat models. Once you have that, then you can figure out, okay, which API, and then you can dig down in that API and figure out the best way to deploy it. Where is API technology and deployments, and where is it going? What do you see down? Is it stagnant, or is it continually developing? And what's the pace of development if it is?
I think at the moment it's still developing. I think we've seen a kind of huge shift, I guess, from when I first started doing this, APIs, remotely access APIs, they were sitting on a server in a nice secure data center. And you only had to worry about the clients really that were kind of out and about, and even the clients often were a business PC on a desk in an office, right? And now we've kind of moved to first kind of mobile and kind of bring your own device and kind of less secure clients, and now we're moving with the IoT where the APIs themselves are often sitting on either gateways or devices themselves that are out in the field somewhere. If you think about industrial IoT, they might literally be out in a field somewhere with nobody around. And so they're kind of is this evolution, I guess, from the physical security being able to be sort of taken for granted for these things to suddenly that being no longer something you can take for granted. And so the threat environment that everything's running in is becoming much more scary, really, and you have to think a lot harder about things that we perhaps ignored before, like the physical vulnerability of the device, or the ability of somebody to extract information off it because they're standing right next to it and nobody else is anywhere around. So that's kind of interesting for me. I think that kind of evolution.
Well, when you mentioned the threat environment, I see it from two sides, and correct me if I'm wrong, or the explosion in terms of the number of and types of applications and devices being used. I mean, you mentioned IoT, and so that's an incredible challenge to secure all of them in the most appropriate way, and at the same time optimize them for performance. But then also, I would imagine that the sophistication of the quote unquote bad actors is increasing, and so they're becoming more aware of some opportunities. Is that what you see? And let's go from there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, both of those things are really important. So yeah, the scale of things as well, and the sheer number of devices and people and so on involved is really changing rapidly. Yeah, and then the sophistication of attackers is also ramping up quite a lot as well now. And I think especially because as the kind of scale of the number of users you're likely to have for an API, or the number of devices when we talk about the IoT is growing so big, that's pushing people to look at more kind of complicated and sophisticated technologies. In particular, a lot of use of cryptography and things like that, whereas they would have pushed everything down to a database before, perhaps, and now they're looking at encryption and signing and things, and so that kind of increases the risk that things can go wrong and provide kind of weaknesses for somebody to then exploit. So the security itself then becomes a risk because it's getting too more complicated.
It's kind of like, and this is my turn at an analogy here, is when Nick Gleason, I don't know if you remember him, he's the trader who brought down Barings. He was he was trading these incredibly complicated derivatives that nobody understood. But he was making money, and everybody's like, yeah, well, let him go. He's making money. And then he got into big trouble, and nobody could figure out what was going on because the derivatives were so complicated. Similar, I guess, to what happened in the financial crisis in 2008 with the mortgage-backed securities that were being traded here, and people just didn't really understand them. And I think, at some point, technology gets to be to that level as well, where people are like, okay, we get it conceptually, but we're kind of pushing the boundaries here of what's been done before. Is there an exploit? Is there an issue with this? And sometimes it's too late, and you find out too late. Yeah. Let's just switch seats for a second here and say that, not as a developer, but as an as an engineer, but as an end user, what makes you nervous when you're coming across an application? What, raises a flag to you and say, you know what, I'm not sure if I want to use this app or put my info in here.
Yeah, I guess there's always a few things, I guess one of the red flags for me is always like overly complicated password policies when you go.
That's just annoying, man.
It's like, yeah,
I'm with you on that. Yeah, it must be 7 to 9 letters, one capital, one lowercase, one number, one symbol. Cannot have been a derivative of any of the last 5 passwords.
Yeah, yeah, those kind of things, because it's kind of like, yeah. What's driving that? It's because that's kind of been discouraged for a long time now. That kind of,
it's a textbook. Somebody read it on their book. Some standard. You would know which standards, but it was there at one point. Here's good password policy is this, right? And well, that's what we got to do. We just annoy everybody and not make it any more secure. So yeah. So what else?
Yeah, I guess more modern things are like. So in the API world now, like if you were writing like a mobile app or something, you'd probably use OAuth to implement the kind of the login and the security, where you'd expect that the app would launch like a web browser for you to go and log in, and then you'd come back. So one of my kind of red flags is when you open like an app, and it just presents you with this username and password box like right in the app then. Because then I'm always like, okay, so have they implemented like the SSL right at the back of this? What are they doing with my password and stuff like that? So those kind of things are the kind of modern thing, I guess, which always worry me.
As an end user, what's the best way to check on that? Or is it?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're not in a web browser, and if ideally, on your phone, the most secure thing is that you should be in the system web browser whenever you're typing in a username and password, because Google and Apple and Mozilla and stuff, they kind of get the security stuff right. And there's a lot of kind of there's a lot of details that have to be get right for your login to be secure, and so if you're just typing it into some random app off the App Store and you're not in a browser, it's kind of like yeah, did they get all those things right? Probably not. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why OAuth is kind of, I think, become so popular in kind of in terms of security, because it means you can kind of bounce out of your app, go to the web browser, they do all the login in there, and then they come back to your app with a kind of token that you can then use, and it's kind of like the web browser and the server take care of all difficult stuff around the authentication there.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I mentioned, we usually go about 30, 40 minutes here. We're coming up on time here. I do want to give a little plug for your book in a second here, but before that, any last thoughts that you'd like to share, either regarding your book or just API security in general, or just about the weather in the place you live in that's near Wales that I've never been to. So.
Yeah, it's pretty grey here, I think, at the moment. I think. So yeah, I mean, it is quite a long book. I didn't start off with it being. So you're definitely getting your money's worth when you buy it. I think part of the reason for that is, as I say in the introduction, is that I think in a lot of this API security, it's really like details matter. So you can't. I think a lot of people kind of pitch. You plug in these devices onto your network. You put your web application firewall here, you have your load balancer here, and here's your authentication server and stuff like that. I mean, you just kind of plug them all together, and I think my kind of philosophy is that you really kind of have to understand all the details and nuts and bolts of things, and so that's kind of hopefully what I kind of get across in the book is that you go through the book and you'll learn how to plug all those things together, but you also learn why you're plugging them together that way, and hopefully that's the important message to get across.
That's excellent. Yeah, not just how but why. Neil, hey, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Like I said, we could probably go on for hours. If we went through, chapter by chapter on your book, I was actually really impressed because I was like, okay, normally this could be, maybe 6 or 7 chapters, but you had chapters and sub-chapters and a lot of different rabbit holes that you could go down, which is excellent. And I'm sure makes your book incredibly valuable. I will mention that the book is available through Manning Publications. In the description for this podcast and for the video, there will be some coupon codes for discounts on the ebook. And you mentioned that you do some YouTube videos, you have a blog. What are your social channels that if somebody wanted to get more information or get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
Yeah, so I have a blog, which is just neilmadden.blog. Easy enough to find. Yeah. I'm also on Twitter, where I'm probably a bit more active, where I'm Neil Mad Dog.
I like that, man.
I went through a lot of variations of Neil Madden before I found a username. I was quite late to Twitter, so.
Mad Dog is it 2 Ds? MADDOG.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I love that. That's great.
Yeah. So those are the main ones. I've been promising myself I'll do some YouTube videos at some time, but I haven't had the time yet. And maybe when we come out of lockdown, I'll start doing some more YouTube videos. But yeah, Twitter and blog at the moment.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm going to put those in the description as well. And hey, really enjoyed talking with you, and appreciate your time. And maybe sometime this spring, when the sun comes out, we can talk about some of the other chapters in the book that we didn't touch on today.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance. Join our hosts as they discuss a wide range of topics and speak with leading cybersecurity, technology, and compliance experts. Now is the time for Secure Talk.